Some of the most feared people in medieval times weren't knights or warlords, they were outlaws. Not because they were powerful, but because they had nothing left to lose. They built a life on the edge of survival, where law and mercy never reached. Before we get into how they lived, we need to understand just how bad it was to become one. The word outlaw gets thrown around a lot these days, but back in medieval times, it meant something far more serious than just being a troublemaker. When someone was declared an outlaw, they were literally placed outside the protection of the law. This wasn't just a fancy way of saying they were in trouble, it was basically a death sentence written in legal language. Once you became an outlaw, anyone could rob you, beat you up, or even kill you without facing any legal consequences. It was worse than being a tax collector. At least people had to pay taxes before they could legally hate you. The authorities didn't care what happened to you because, legally speaking, you no longer existed as a person with rights. This terrible fate could happen to someone for reasons that seem ridiculous today. Failing to show up in court was enough to get you outlawed. Missing a court date because you were sick, couldn't afford to travel, or simply didn't know about it could ruin your entire life. Medieval court systems had all the flexibility of a stone wall and about as much understanding. The system was so harsh that it could affect entire families. If the head of a household was declared an outlaw, sometimes his wife and children would face similar treatment. Women technically couldn't be declared outlaws because of medieval legal traditions, but they could be declared waived, which meant pretty much the same thing. Property confiscation was automatic when someone became an outlaw. The crown or local lord would swoop in and take everything: houses, land, livestock, tools, even cooking pots. Medieval repo men were apparently even more thorough than modern ones, and they didn't need to worry about paperwork. Your entire life's work could disappear overnight. Many people who ended up as outlaws weren't criminals in the way we think of them today. Some were political enemies who had crossed the wrong noble or official. Others were simply poor people who had fallen into debt and couldn't dig their way out. Records from 13th century England show that thousands of men were listed as outlaws in just a few counties. Being an outlaw was a legal status, not just a description of someone's behavior. Courts would formally declare someone an outlaw through official proceedings, complete with documentation and announcements. The medieval justice system had all the mercy of a hungry wolf and about as much interest in second chances. The psychological impact was enormous. People who had been respected members of their communities suddenly found themselves cast out, with former friends and neighbors afraid to help them. Some outlaws tried to appeal their status, but this was extremely difficult and expensive. The road ahead for these desperate people was filled with danger and uncertainty, starting with the immediate challenge. Dark, twisted forests became home to those who had nowhere else to go. These weren't pleasant woodland paths. Medieval forests were dangerous places where ordinary people feared to venture, making them perfect refugees for those society had abandoned. Medieval forests were basically nature's version of a maximum security prison, except the inmates had to build their own cells and catch their own food. Most people avoided these deep woods, believing them to be filled with wild animals, bandits, and supernatural dangers. This fear worked to the outlaws' advantage. Finding shelter required creativity born from desperation. Outlaws would carve out spaces inside the hollow trunks of massive old trees, creating tiny living quarters that barely had room for one person to lie down. Living in a tree trunk was like staying in the world's worst hotel room, except the room service involved catching your own rats. Others dug underground hideouts, carefully covering the entrances with branches, leaves, and dirt to create invisible doorways. These earthen shelters were cold and damp, with water seeping through the walls during rainy seasons. Building these shelters required tools that outlaws often didn't have, forcing them to improvise with sharp rocks and broken branches. The art of remaining invisible became a matter of life and death. Outlaws memorized secret pathways through the thickest parts of the forest, following routes that only they knew existed. Movement during daylight hours was extremely risky, so most outlaws became nocturnal. Fire presented an impossible choice. Warmth and cooked food were essential, but smoke could be seen from miles away. Cooking dinner became a military operation with more planning than most royal weddings. Many outlaws learned to build tiny fires in deep pits, using only the driest wood to minimize smoke production. Hunting provided the most reliable source of meat, but it required weapons and skills that not everyone possessed. Outlaws fashioned crude spears from sharpened sticks and learned to set snares for rabbits and other small animals. Stealing from farms provided necessary supplies, but required careful planning and perfect timing. Salt was more precious than gold to people trying to preserve meat in the wilderness. Without this essential mineral, any meat they caught would spoil quickly in warm weather. Medieval outlaws would risk their lives for a handful of salt, which really puts modern grocery shopping complaints in perspective. The weather became a constant enemy. Wool clothing became heavy and uncomfortable when wet. Shoes and boots wore out quickly on rough forest terrain, and replacing them was nearly impossible. Many outlaws ended up wrapping their feet in strips of leather or cloth. Despite all these challenges, some outlaws found unexpected allies among the common people. Sympathetic peasants might leave food in agreed-upon locations, or priests might provide medicine and information about planned searches. However, the wilderness held dangers beyond cold, hunger, and loneliness. While outlaws struggled to survive in their forest hideouts, medieval society developed an entire network of people whose job was to track them down and drag them back to face justice. These hunters turned the pursuit of fugitives into both a profession and a competitive sport that attracted people from all walks of life. Sheriffs led most organized hunting efforts, treating outlaw captures like military campaigns that required careful planning and coordination. Being a medieval sheriff was like being a combination of police chief and professional pest control specialist, except the pests could fight back with swords. These officials had the authority to gather groups of men and coordinate large-scale searches across vast areas of countryside. The sheriff's reputation and career prospects depended heavily on his success in maintaining order within his territory. Having notorious outlaws running around made him look incompetent to his superiors, while successful captures could lead to promotions and increased respect from both nobles and common people. Many professional bounty hunters were former soldiers who had learned tracking and combat skills during various wars. When armies disbanded after battles ended, these men often found that hunting outlaws provided steady income and familiar work. Medieval bounty hunters were basically unemployed soldiers who had discovered that chasing people through forests paid better than farming turnips. These professional hunters were like medieval private investigators, except instead of taking photos of cheating spouses, they dragged people back to town to be hanged. They brought military discipline and tactics to what had previously been amateur efforts by local villagers, making them far more dangerous than ordinary citizens trying to earn reward money. Tracking dogs played crucial roles in many hunting expeditions, especially in regions where Norman nobles had introduced this practice. These specially trained hounds could follow scent trails that were days old, leading hunters directly to outlaw camps and hideouts. Medieval tracking dogs were probably more reliable than most of the human hunters, and they definitely complained less about working conditions. Local communities were actively encouraged to participate in outlaw hunting through systems of rewards and incentives. Capturing a fugitive could earn someone money, livestock, clothing, or legal favors from authorities. For struggling peasants, these rewards represented significant windfalls that could feed their families for months. Medieval neighborhoods apparently had their own version of neighborhood watch programs, except instead of reporting suspicious activity, people got paid for dragging their neighbors to jail. Information was often more valuable than physical captures. Informants who could provide details about outlaw locations could earn substantial rewards without risking their lives. The psychology of betrayal ran deep in medieval society. Economic hardship and personal jealousy motivated many people to turn against outlaws they had once known. Former allies might betray fugitives to save themselves from suspicion or to gain favor with local authorities who controlled their economic opportunities. Medieval informants were like medieval social media influencers, except instead of getting likes and follows, they got coins and stayed alive. The reward system created interesting social dynamics where people who successfully captured outlaws gained prestige and respect from their neighbors. Forest laws gave gamekeepers broad powers to arrest anyone found in royal or noble woodlands without permission. They knew their territories intimately and could recognize signs that someone had been camping or hunting illegally. Many outlaws were captured during routine patrols rather than dramatic chases. Village networks played important roles in outlaw hunting by creating informal intelligence systems. News of sightings or suspicious activities would spread quickly from one community to another, carried by merchants, travelers, and local officials who maintained regular contact between settlements. Some hunting expeditions became extended campaigns lasting weeks or months, with large groups systematically searching entire forests. These operations required significant organization and expense, but they were often successful in clearing outlaws from specific regions. The most successful hunters learned to think like their prey, understanding the psychology of desperate people and predicting where they might go or what they might do next. This psychological warfare was often more effective than physical tracking. Despite all these efforts and the considerable resources devoted to hunting them down, many outlaws discovered that their best chance of survival lay in joining forces with others who shared their desperate circumstances. Desperation has a way of bringing strangers together, and medieval outlaws quickly discovered that survival became much easier when they weren't facing the wilderness alone. Outlaw gangs formed naturally as solitary fugitives found each other and realized that cooperation offered advantages no individual could achieve. The smallest groups consisted of just 2 or 3 people, often friends who had been outlawed together or strangers who had encountered each other by chance in the forest. 3 desperate people hiding in medieval forests was like the world's worst camping trip, except nobody had packed any supplies and the park rangers were trying to kill them. These tiny groups had to be extremely careful about everything they did, as they lacked the numbers to fight off serious threats. Larger gangs might include dozens of members, creating organizations that resembled small armies more than simple criminal groups. These bigger gangs could control significant territories, establish permanent camps with defensive positions, and defend themselves against most threats. However, size brought complications that smaller groups never had to face. Division of labor became essential for larger outlaw gangs to function without chaos. Different members specialized in specific roles based on their skills and experience. Medieval outlaw gangs had to develop their own job descriptions and work schedules, except their human resources department was whoever had the sharpest knife. Some